Welcome back, everybody, to Two Guys and a Stack of Comics. My name is Reed. Along with me, as always, is Mike. Mike, how are you doing this week, sir?
I'm doing good. I'm wearing the Jay Garrick Flash shirt today. That always makes me feel special.
Nice, yeah. Oh, Jay, you got Barry, a lot of cool Flash shirts.
I
Um,
know, and the new Jay Garrick came out today, but
yeah.
I'm stuck at work, so I can't get it until this weekend.
Hopefully, you get a chance to read it.
I'll pick it up tomorrow. I'll be over at the comic shop tomorrow. You know, I can't wait for that.
Yeah. No, so speaking of some classic characters like Jay Garrick, one of the interesting things that has popped up recently, most prevalently this year with Mickey Mouse, or the Steamboat Willie version of Mickey Mouse, entering the public domain. So, public domain basically, after about 95 years, after the first kind of appearance of a character, it sets in and becomes public domain. There have been some big characters this has happened with before. Sherlock Holmes is public domain, Zorro is public domain, but
Is
our
Conan
focus,
public domain yet?
which one?
Conan, because didn't
Conan's
Robert E.
close.
Howard?
Yeah, Conan
Yeah,
should be close. For the comic book aspect, what's rather big on this though is Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, some of the icons, and really the brands that keep DC Comics afloat. We're about a decade away, or a little less than a decade in some cases, of those characters entering the public domain. And so, Mike and I just want to talk a little bit about how do we think that'll impact the overall world of comics? Do we think it could be a good thing, a bad thing? How will that affect DC, and kind of just our overall thoughts on public domain? So, Mike, for you with some of these classic characters entering public domain, what is just your overall thoughts of like the potential of this happening?
you know, I don't know. I, my first thought is I'm a little bit nervous. But then my second thought is, I wonder, what somebody could do with it. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag because if you were paying attention late last year, Winnie the Pooh went
Yeah,
into the public domain and they made that crazy, silly movie,
like a slasher film with Winnie the Pooh. Yeah,
Blood and Honey or something like that. Yeah,
yeah,
I didn't see it, but I saw some clips from it. I was like, oh my gosh. I know Jackson watched it and he laughed and it was kind of funny. So like you can imagine them taking Superman or even if you go back to the 70s, I forget who it was, but there was an underground artist who did some really inappropriate things with Mickey Mouse and Disney
hmm
sued him. Like that's the kind of thing that's going to go on. We're getting like a ridiculous Superman movie. Will he be treated inappropriately like Mickey
yeah,
Mouse was in an underground comic, or what's going to happen?
yeah. I think the
You just
crazy thing is, I would be, it's weird in that I would normally be very excited for something to enter public domain, and then I think, in all honesty, I do think DC Comics has kind of deserved to lose the license of these characters with some of the things they've done. And I used to think a little more worried as far as like maybe, they wouldn't treat it with the respect DC would. But then you look at some of the storylines and the things that does with their characters sometimes, and it's like, okay, maybe it might be a good thing. I think the Winnie the Pooh
you
thing, the scary part is the slashers and the people who are going to take it in a disgusting direction where it doesn't need to be.
you know that is going to be the knee jerk reaction, like that guy in the 70s that got in trouble with Disney. I mean, he had a circulation of like 5,000 copies of his little underground comic, but
Yeah.
it caused all this sensation. And how can Mickey and Minnie be doing anything like that
Yeah.
together on paper? So, like, that's going to be the first initial knee jerk reaction. Every
hmm
idiot with two brains is going to go to town on these
Yeah.
icons that we hold dear. So that's my first fear. The other thing is, though, the possibilities. What if we had a really like incredible artist writer team that didn't have to worry about the bean counters
Strange. Yeah.
at Warner Brothers, and could do what they wanted with it. Some amazing stories could be told. yes, some stupid, inappropriate stories will be told.
Yeah.
But after that wears off, after the hijinks blow over,
Yeah. No, I do think there's potential in that, probably 10 years ago, I'd have been like dreading the day that DC Comics loses the exclusivity license for them. I'll be honest, I mean, as much as I'm dreading the stupid stuff that's going to come from it, if this means there's going to be comic book creators who can, without the constraints of the editors at DC Comics who don't seem to know anything anymore, um, I think it would be interesting. And I think there's potential. And I think the other thing that would open up is I think there's a possibility you might see creative teams who haven't worked on comics in a while get involved because they could control it and also profit from it. I
they could
think,
be like, I always had that idea. And, Leibowitz and Donefeld always shot me down.
yeah. Well, no, I think the thing is, what I will say I think has hurt comics more than anything is it used to be the way to make money in comics was to write the big two, write Spider-Man, write Batman, then your name would get out there. That's no longer the way to make money in comic books. Your top tier creators, they go create their own stuff. Your Jeff Johnsons, he's running his own line and they get into TV producer. Mark Millar Mark Miller has been a guy who's done that where he gets stuff, turns it into movies. Your top flight
Frank Miller.
do their own stuff. And so the
Frank,
thing is, I think so many good creators don't even work for DC or Marvel anymore because the constraints and also of creativity, but also financially. Whereas you might get 10 years from now a top tier writer and artist who DC don't want to pay the money to, who all of a sudden can produce their own Batman work. And if it works and it's popular and it sells, they're going to reap the financial rewards of that. Um, I think the thing where I don't feel bad with these particular characters, um, I know there's contract work and people doing things, and technically, if you work for a company, they own it. But Bill Finger and Bob Kane are not around anymore. They created Batman, and a bunch of people who had nothing to do with the creation of Batman have been betting
Siegel and
on that for
Schuster,
years. Yeah, Siegel and
Jerry
Schuster,
Robinson.
even when you get to the Marvel characters, right? Lee, Ditko, and Kirby are not there, and you've got these creators now all making money off of their work. And yes, I know it's a contract. You work for a company; they own the IP. I got you. But I think overall, I think the financial incentive will be back for a lot of these writers, these top tier ones, to actually start working again. And I think what I would hope is that I don't know how DC Comics survives this if they continue the way they are now. I would
That's
with
the
them
other side of the
seeing,
coin.
I would hope with them seeing like, their sales declining and this coming, that maybe they would start to take some chances, put some better people on books, really go for it so they can get a stranglehold on it. Because in all honesty, with the way the books are trending and sales being down and the way that DC hasn't exactly navigated the minefield of comics currently well, this would kind of be the death blow for them, I think, if they start, you're not the only one who can make Batman comics anymore. The only part that'll be interesting is like not everything enters the IP. So like the public domain. So like they get the Batman that appeared in Detective 27, right? That year. So they don't get the Batmobile, Alfred, the Batcave, Batarangs, all that stuff. Anything that was invented later.
That could be
Doesn't
an
enter.
interesting story, though.
Yeah. No,
I kind of like the back to basics.
no, no. And I think that's the weird thing is I think you may actually see, of course, we're gonna get the stupid like the Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey stuff. I think there's a Mickey Mouse slasher movie coming out now too. We're gonna get that stupid stuff. But
It's
we might get
inevitable.
some people who write some back to basics, character driven stuff, and they don't have where it's just so funny because I think for a while, I think now DC takes Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman for granted. I think they kind of feel like we can throw this name on a title, give zero effort into it, and just it's there. We got Batman. You like Batman, buy Batman. Whereas some of these other things, it will either make DC up their game or they're going to go out of business.
Yeah, I kind of wonder what that world would look like because you could we're going to do a thought experiment here. Okay. We're 10 years in the future and we have to assume that the presses are still rolling.
Yeah. Who knows if comics are even around? Yeah, that's true.
But I will tell you, and you and I probably had this conversation 10 years ago, but I definitely had this conversation 20 years ago with other comic enthusiasts that, oh my gosh, it's 1998. I don't know if they're going to be printing comics anymore.
Yeah.
And that was definitely a thing where Marvel almost collapsed and DC almost collapsed. And anyway, that was definitely a thing. So let's take for granted, let's do the thought experiment. Yes, the presses are still rolling.
Hmm.
And 10 years later, and all these properties go into the public domain. The only moment to take advantage of that would be when the ridiculous stuff comes out, because there'll be the hype
Yep.
and they'll go to the store, and DC will have their top writers and artists on their flagship characters. So yes, you could see a Superman slasher movie slash porn, whatever is going to come out,
Ridiculous crap they put out. Yeah.
ridiculous, but you could get a really good real Superman story that, like, all the hype will be like, oh, like Superman's in the public domain and they're ruining him, but there's a good edition on the shelf for you to pick up and really fall in love with the true character. The other thing is, let's go another 2 years into the future where all the craziness has died down.
Hmm.
And here's your big two uh, shelves at your comic store with all the big Marvel DC lineups for the month. And then next to it is the 4 to 6 shelves that are the indie
It are the
comics.
indie books. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you got 2 shelves of your tried and true DC Marvel, and you got 6 or 16 shelves of indie comics. And you got half a dozen crazy Batman, Superman stuff going on in the indie.
Hmm.
You got to be able to compete, and you got to have some good star talent. Like, I don't know, how do you recruit that
Well, I think
when
that's the problem DC is going to have when this does happen is, you can look online and see a bunch of stories about comic book artists and comic book writers not getting paid for work on time, not getting paid a lot of salary, just being treated poorly overall. And while I do, my heart does go out for them a little bit. Part of me also doesn't really empathize with them because you're riding the coattails of people who made this stuff great, and then you don't really show the proper respect for it a lot of times, and then you
well
make these kind of ridiculous changes, and then and so everyone should be paid on time for the work they've done. But where I think DC and Marvel are going to struggle is if you want to keep paying your artists and the folks as you are, where it's contract work, they have no stake in the sales, it's a flat rate. That's not going to work anymore once this hits public domain. I think that's the big thing they're going to have to get into, and I honestly think it would be great for comics if that changed across the board, because what I see with so many creative teams is the guy writing Batman seems to be paid a salary, and that's his salary. And so if Batman sells 250,000 copies, I get this. If Batman sells 50,000 copies, I get the same check. And so I think that's why we see so many horrible books released. Because if these people had to produce content that people were actually going to buy, and the sales of the book were what determined their salary, I think you'd see a lot better art. I think you'd see a lot better writing. I think you'd see some of the dumb storylines and things where they're like today I'm going to be, I read Amazing Spider-Man today. I think Peter Parker was on 2 pages. In a world where the sales of that would dictate your salary, you're not going to be a writer and put that issue out. And I think that could correct with this public domain thing, where all of a sudden it becomes more competitive, more salary driven, more, hey, sales are what's going to dictate this. As much as I just don't like the idea of there being stupid stuff like the slasher flicks and all the weird things that are going to come. I do think at the end of the day, for comic books as a whole, it might be positive for this stuff to enter the public domain. And that's crazy because 10 years ago, I never would have said that.
it should, but the other possibility for the future is, well, there's two avenues. One is bright, one is dark. So we
Mhm.
get to that day, eight, what is it, 5, 6,
I think it's about 8 years away for Superman, and then
8 years in
Batman
the
9, I think.
future. Okay. Superman's in the public domain. Between now and that day, DC creates new characters.
Yeah. No, and that
And
and that might be what they have to do, and that um,
you got to build something
you
new
got to
that
build
DC
something.
owns, that's amazing, that's wonderful. There were some offshoots of Wonder Woman the last couple of years. the Wonder Girl,
Yeah, Yara
uh,
Flor and that kind of stuff. Yeah,
maybe something like that could happen, and they could be their big juggernaut, so that when these characters fall by the wayside, they have their own strong storylines for a new generation. That would be the other thing is that the presses fall silent,
yeah. No, I
and
mean, I think
they
if
close up
anything,
shop. I mean, what would the world be like without Marvel and DC? Marvel would continue on for a little while longer, but
yeah, Marvel would have a good 20 something years of still owning most of their characters. But I think
DC
the
could be
thing
like
is,
a boutique indie title, like they put
what
out 6 books a month, and
what I'll say though, I mean, and it's weird because I still mainly read Marvel and DC, but it's and there's still some good books, and we love to highlight the good books. But I think overall, it's kind of you get what you deserve some of this with DC Comics, and
I
that
mean
I
they
will say
were.
I think really for me the last decade of comics, while there have been some genuine great spotlight books that have been fantastic, I would see 70% of the line they're hiring people for the wrong reasons. They're hiring people who don't care about the character, who want to just, I'm going to come in and do whatever I want to do. And it doesn't work. I think
And,
you and me have talked about this a lot. A character that I just am so tired of having terrible comic books is Captain America because they just keep hiring people who seem to have like a personal grudge against Steve Rogers. It's like Steve Rogers must have taken their lunch money from them as a kid or something. And I'm just,
that never happened,
which
I'm
would
telling
never happen.
you.
Like there's so many writers that write Iron Man and Captain
Steve
America,
Rogers would give you his lunch if you didn't have any money.
where the writer just seems to have like a personal grudge of like this book is going to be my complaint session about how much Steve Rogers sucks. And I think because they've driven sales to where they've driven them, and because they've pushed away so many customers, and yeah, the hardcore guys like you and me are still there. I think the public domain thing might actually be good because then the incentive, well, if you have all this competition, you might have 10 different, well, I mean, there's already 10 different Batman comics coming out, but you might have 50 different Batman comic books coming out. And the cream of the crop is going to rise and the rest are going to sink and they're not going to make it and they're not going to publish it anymore. And that's the whole thing. And we see this online. I mean, there's a lot of companies that are releasing books on their own and through Indiegogo and different things. And I've seen some sites where they own their own books and own their own materials and stuff. And it's all with those companies what I have to give them credit for. Well, it's hard for me to go into indie books because I just don't have the character loyalty. What I'll give them is they have to produce what their customers want and they have to produce quality because you have to earn the customer with
And
every
you
single sell.
got to catch that audience in the first issue,
Yep.
and you got to keep them interested from the 6th issue, um, or however long the run is. And so you got to write good stories. I was talking with one of my local comic shop people, and she was saying that half the time she knows after the 3rd issue, and she'll stop ordering copies of it. She might order one,
Mm.
and just because she knows that it was hot when it started. They sold 30 copies of issue 1. They sold 15 of 2, and so like you really have to write like to make it past that third
No,
issue.
there are no ridiculous filler issues. There are
Yeah,
no junk issues with an artist who wasn't the main art. And I think that's the thing that DC and Marvel have taken for granted is they kind of just feel like we throw Amazing Spider-Man out, we're entitled to 100,000 copies being sold. Whereas
and
with
I don't
indie
know.
books, no, hey man, if we put a junk artist on this book or if it's 6 weeks late, we may not
Yeah,
recover from that.
yeah, it's more of a time crunch. Well, let me throw this to you too about the modern state of things. And if it really goes this way, I mean, this could be, another sign, but it really seems like more and more like their goal is to get to the indie, but some of them get their cred by getting on salary with DC or Marvel, and then the
Yeah.
indies swipe them up and they end up there. It
No,
used to
it's
be the
completely
other way
flipped.
around. It's
No,
totally flipped. Is that not
yeah,
true?
no, it's how I would look at it, and that you kind of see now. It's like I'll write enough big two comics that I build my name, and then I can go do my own thing. and that
Yeah, and you go to indie.
even
And it
guys
used
who
to be,
don't write humongous runs that are massively successful, as soon as their name becomes a name, it's like, man, I'm done. I'm going to the
I
indie.
got I got my resume item, but it used to be the other way around. I mean, guys would scrap at the bottom and work for like uh Charlton or what was
Oh, no, but you
the
used to have like Dark Horse
Malibu
and yeah, Malibu Comics,
Malibu
Dark
Comics in
Horse.
the 80s, and they would grind it out for like years in the bottom tier, and then the clouds would part and they would get an offer for DC or Marvel. It's
No,
not
it's
like
funny in that
anymore.
like you used to see, and this is the weird part for me is like sometimes I'll read these books and like the guy who's writing a large book, I'll look and I'm like, how did you get this job? Like, interestingly enough, I think Batman has always still kept that in that, like, most of the time when I've seen a Batman writer, they've typically proven themselves writing other comics. I haven't seen Batman ever have a main writer on the main Batman title where you're like, man, where did you come from? But I've seen lately with like Spider-Man, in nothing against the current writer of Spider-Man, I'm sure he's paid his dues. But like his name now is Zeb Wells, the writer on Spider-Man. I'm like, what successful run of comics did you write that like made you the guy to get Spider-Man? Like
I
this
know,
used to be
flagship
like
comic.
the prime time gig that like the best writer would get. And it's like, I'm not saying nothing negative against Zeb Wells. I'm sure he's got his fans, but it's like, I don't ever remember seeing a run from Zeb Wells where it was like, man, this comic is flying off the shelves. Look what he did with, Moon Knight or Luke Cage or something. That's why he's on Spider-Man. And it doesn't really seem to be there. And like even greats like Jeff Johns did all that work. I think he was Teen Titans, and then after Teen Titans, he was JSA, and then Green Lantern, and then he became the Justice League writer, and he got
Yeah.
like, a big book. And it kind of seems now like the opposite, where it's just like, you work here and you've written some comics. Here's Amazing Spider-Man. And nothing against, I'm sure they've done their work. I'm not saying they're untalented, but it just seems like the proving grounds used to be you start on some small like the spin-off X-Men title and then you write like an individual character and then you're handed the X-Men book. Now
It was an
it's
elite
different.
club. If you got into that writer artist club, I mean, it was so small in the 70s and the 80s. And it broadened a little bit in the 90s, but think of how close knit, Stan used to always call it what did he call it? He had a baseball reference for it.
Bullpen.
The
Yeah.
bullpen. Yeah.
Marvel bullpen.
It was just a small little group. You had Ditko, Kirby, Gene Colan, Roy Thomas, Stan Lee. Who else was there before Steranko and them
Well, like
came
Roy
in?
Thomas was in there, right? I think you said Thomas. Yeah,
Yeah, Roy.
you had so many, and I think that's the thing
That
is
was it.
those guys
That was it.
proved themselves on their
And to
book.
break into that, like when the new guys were trying to come in the 70s, it was
Yeah.
like really hard because you had the juggernauts of the industry. I mean, they were giants.
Well, no, that's the weird thing is like, I mean, I'll see books that are still being published that are main books. How did that writer get that job? Like their last six comics get canceled in like 5 issues. And then they get an ongoing with a steady character. And it's like, how did that happen? Like
And
it doesn't seem to make sense.
that's the thing that's got to change. Like if they are truly going to have 8 years where they've got to build brand new characters, think outside the box, and do something really special like
You got
Superman
to
and
take the
Batman,
relatively few hit
where
makers who are still working for the big two
you've
and get them
got
on.
to.
Or I think in the next 8 years, they're going to have to find a model that works better to get some of these indie guys to come back to at least make it competitive. Like, hey, if you sell a Batman book and everything over 100,000 copies, you make the profit on or something like that to incentivize it. Because I think
Yeah.
that's the biggest thing that's hurt comics is, like you said, it's completely flipped. You used to work your way up to get to Marvel and DC, which was kind of like even in baseball terms, you do the minor leagues, and then DC and Marvel was the show. That was the MLB,
Yeah,
that
that
was
was the
the
big
Yankees.
show.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
was now it's kind of reversed where it's like I'm sure you have to do a little bit of work to get to Marvel and DC, but like you work your way through your Marvel and DC years, and then bam, you've become an indie writer now whose name can sell stuff.
Isn't that
It's
weird?
crazy.
It's so strange, but that's the way it is now.
And I think maybe this public domain thing might influence that back, and that it'll be
You have to
interesting
let
though. I
them
mean,
fire.
it's going to be the most important decade for DC Comics ever because they are either going to completely sink and be gone, or they will solidify themselves and find a new model that works and they can kind of withstand this public domain thing. But it'll be interesting. It'll certainly be interesting in the next couple years. We see more of these like Mickey Mouse and characters like that. And I just hope it doesn't trend all into the ridiculous, stupid slasher idiot things. But we shall see.
It'll happen for the first year or so. Just wait.
Yeah.
But
Well,
then
no,
once
because
all the
everybody
track,
will rush to put out the cheapest low budget
yeah,
thing they can, and
I
that's
can put out
typically
my
what
own Superman comic. Who's this Clark Kent guy? I can write
yeah.
that.
We will see. Let us know what you guys think below. Do you think this will be a good thing or a bad thing for Marvel and DC as some of these characters get closer to public domain? Do you think it'll force them to change and get more competitive? Or do you think it's just this is going to be game over for it? Let us know what you think below. As always, we appreciate you watching, and we will see you with our next video.